Hi, I'm Janet Rose Ray, and today I wanted to give you a kind of an overview of the concepts of good clinical practices. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my slides. And again, think of concepts, general issues, etc., as we move forward through this topic. So today I'm going to talk about the concepts of good clinical practices. Some concepts I would like you to come away with include understanding the fundamental and overarching responsibilities of persons who perform a clinical study. What are the major documents that are used in a clinical study, and what are the source of these requirements? Major concepts that I'm going to talk about today include references, nomenclature, the principles, major documents, specifically the investigator's brochure, the protocol, informed consent, and putting it all together. Looking at the references, there's a lot of references that are worldwide that provide guidance for clinical trial and good clinical practices. In the United States, there is not one CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, that addresses good clinical practices. Instead, there are what I call pieces that are located in a number of different sections. 21 CFR is the guidance for all food and drug activities. Part 312 addresses the investigational new drug application, and in there it does provide some of the elements of good clinical practices, but doesn't describe it as such. 56 addresses institutional review boards or the ethics committees. 54 is important in the United States because it discusses the financial disclosure requirements by clinical investigators. Section 50 addresses the protection of human subjects, which is also related to informed consent, and also 45 CFR, which relates to human health and human services. Part 46 also addresses the protection of human subjects in clinical studies. The FDA has also adopted the ICH documents on good clinical practices, specifically ICH E6 and subsequent addendums as it relates to good clinical practices. This is probably one of the more comprehensive and detailed sections about good clinical practices, and especially it's good because it defines the requirements of the documents I'm going to be talking about later on. The Therapeutics Goods Administration, or TGA in Australia, has the Clinical Trial Handbook, and that's the exact title. You can Google that. It also has some very excellent information. And then, of course, the European Union using EMA.Europa, I think I got that spelled wrong, .eu, can also be very helpful. But probably the best place to start if you want more details is the ICH E6. But I'd like to go through the ICH E6 and some of the concepts. Clinical trials should be conducted in accordance with an ethical principles and have their origin in the Declaration of Helsinki. Declaration of Helsinki is a document that describes treatment of subjects, clinical studies, etc., but especially focuses on the rights of clinical trial subjects. Prior to initiating a trial, foreseeable risks and any inconveniences should be weighed against a potential benefit for an individual trial subject and the best interest of society as a whole. The trial should be initiated and continued only if the anticipated risks or anticipated benefits justify the risks. The rights, safety, and well-being of trial subjects are the most important considerations and should prevail over the interests of science and society. What that means is that and this emanates from a lot of trials that were where placebos were used for a long time, such as the syphilis trial, in which patients were not given any antibiotics for 45 years to see how the disease progressed. That's a good example of the rights and safety and well-being of a trial subject not being the primary interest of that particular study. Available non-clinical and clinical information on an investigation or product should be adequate to support the proposed clinical trial. Clinical trials should also be scientifically sound and described in a clear and detailed protocol. The trial should be conducted in compliance with the protocol that has previously been approved by the Institution Review Board of the Independent Ethics Committee with a favorable opinion. It seems like a no-brainer, but there are times when that has not happened. The medical care given to and medical decisions made on the behalf of the subject should always be the responsibility of a qualified physician or, when appropriate, a qualified dentist. Again, we're looking at worldwide kinds of things. Each individual involved in conducting a trial should be qualified by the education, training, experience to perform the assigned tasks. If you've seen protocols or certain types of applications in different countries, the role of each individual with regard to the clinical trial is often identified, and their qualifications are also often provided as well. And that may be in a nomenclature either through a CV, licensing, etc. Informed consent, and we'll talk about this, must be freely given and obtained for every subject prior to clinical trial participation. This also includes screening procedures in order to determine if somebody would be a suitable candidate for a clinical trial. They must absolutely be given informed consent before anything is happening. And then the clinical trial information must be recorded, handled, and stored in a way that allows viewers to check the veracity of the reporting, interpretation, and verification. Series of checks and balances. The confidentiality of records that could identify subjects must be protected, and the rights of the privacy and confidentiality rules in each country must be applied. So that's why what we call personal health information is something that we also value and write into protocols and in the procedures associated with clinical trials to ensure the confidentiality of each participant. Investigational products should be manufactured, handled, and stored in accordance with applicable good manufacturing practices, and they should be used according to the protocol. Additionally, the products should be manufactured in a way to ensure that they won't pose untoward risk and that they're sterile, they're safe, they don't carry bacteria, etc. The systems and procedures that assure the quality of every aspect of the trial should be implemented. That's a huge umbrella, but it means basically everything needs to be documented. There need to be procedures, and everybody is expected to follow them, including the protocol. And lastly, the aspects of the trial that are essential to ensure human subject protection and reliability of trial results should be the focus of the systems outlined in the previous bullet point. So then the question becomes how to achieve the GCP principles. There's three major documents that I want to focus on. The first one is the investigator's brochure, followed by the protocol and the informed consent form or the informed consent documents. Additional documents that can help to achieve clinical trials in a consistent and well-run manner include pharmacy or laboratory manuals, clinical report forms in which the data are recorded, etc. The investigator's brochure is a compilation of clinical and non-clinical data on the investigational product or products that are relevant to the study of the products and the human subjects. Why this is important is that this provides background information so the physician or the team can make appropriate decisions in treating the patient if there is anything that comes up unexpectedly during the study. The purpose is to provide, as I indicated, the investigators and others involved in the trial with the information to facilitate their understanding of and the rationale for the many features of the protocol, such as dose frequency, intervals, methods of administration, safety monitoring, etc. It also, as I indicated, provides insight to support the clinical management of study subjects during the course of the clinical trial. I like the structure that's identified in the ICH E6 because it's very well organized and it provides detail about each sections and what should be in there. The information conveyed in this should be provided in a concise, simple, and objective, balanced, non-promotional manner. I heard one trial medical officer one time says, well, we put everything in there, so we covered all the bases. The problem was that investigator brochure was 145 pages, and clearly no one was going to read that amount. So it's important to take a look at and view the investigator brochure as a tool to help to facilitate understanding, and facilitate the execution of the protocol and treating subjects appropriately. Importantly, it's non-promotional, and it has to be objective and balanced. The sponsor is responsible for this document, and I would say that the key feature of this particular document is information. So the protocol is a second major document for performing a clinical study and to help ensure good clinical practice conformance or compliance. It's a formal document that describes all aspects of the clinical study. And the objective is to ensure all procedures and aspects of the study are performed in a consistent manner. Especially for trials that run for many months or years, of well-written and understandable clinical study protocols is critical to ensure that there is consistency amongst the procedures performed, the data recorded over the period of time that the trial is undergoing. And so you can make sure that the data that comes out at the beginning and the end is essentially the same, came from the same procedures, testing, etc. Now they may evolve, but then you know what those points are and you can reevaluate the data accordingly. The structure is important because it needs to state the objectives and purpose of the study, who are the investigators, the facilities, where is this going to be taken, where this is going to be placed. What's the description and the design of the study? Are there control groups? What are they for? What are the analytical methods used to minimize bias on the part of the subjects, investigators, and analysts? This would also include any blinding procedures that are performed, etc. The method for determining the dose to be administered, and again, this would be in a dose escalation study or repeat study, etc. And what's the planned maximum dose, duration of individual patient exposure to the drug, and also the maximum exposure that a subject could experience. A description of the observations and measurements to be made to fulfill the objectives of the study. This usually relates to things like physical exams, safety laboratory measurements, physical things such as blood pressure, respiration, temperature, etc. And of course, it's going to depend on the nature of the population that's being studied, whether it's somebody that's acutely ill in a hospital or for chronic use where somebody is taking a medication at a regular basis for a longer period of time. So that was going to drive the details and the amount of information that's going to be recovered. But again, the rationale for the study is really important, and that's going to drive some of the methods and timing of these types of measurements. The description of the clinical procedures, laboratory tests, and other measures taken to monitor the effects of the drug in human subjects and to minimize risk. This is something you'd usually find in what I call the schedule of events. It'll also be a schedule of events based, it's a timeline with all the procedures listed, when they're collected, etc. And it's a good guide for people who are doing this study, so you don't have to go page by page every time. Information should be presented in a sufficiently detailed and organized manner to ensure consistent practices. I've seen some protocols that are very difficult to really understand what needs to be done. So there's got to be a combination of formatting to make it easy to comprehend. People are busy. They may not have the time to really review the pages every single time there's a patient coming through. So it's important to write this so that it is easy to read, easy to follow, easy to comprehend, and that there are sections that will have the detail, and then the detailed rationales, etc., are in there as well, where additional information can be provided. The responsibility for the protocol is the sponsor. And I would say the key piece of this is consistency, the consistency of the study. Lastly, I want to talk about the informed consent. The informed consent is not just a document or a short form. It's really a process. It includes both the verbal and written documentation that define risks, procedures, potential benefits of a subject participating in a clinical study. It also is going to be customized to reflect the local beliefs, practices of an institution or a geographical area. And then this is where the IRB comes in, because they're going to look at things from local customs, etc. The purpose of this document and process is to ensure the prospective subject understands all aspects of the study and the responsibilities and risks of participating. Probably the major case that really focused on informed consent was Jesse Gelsinger, who participated in a gene therapy study around in the early 2000s. I think it was 1999. The informed consent process was questioned, and at the end of the day, he did lose his life. He was an 18-year-old subject. Following that, that tragic death, plus a protocol, as I understand it, was not entirely followed. So a lot of focus has really come into informing patients or prospective patients of the risks, and that they're very clear about the risks. They have an opportunity to ask questions, etc. There's a lot that's been written about the informed consent process. The structure of the document is defined in 21 CFR Part 50.25. I think it's probably, there's a lot written about informed consent. The basic line is that it needs to be, again, well organized, easy to find information, and recognizing that prospective patients are probably nervous. They are often stressed because they've had a new diagnosis of a disease. And so it needs to be, the process needs to respect those issues associated with that particular subject population, so a patient can get the information they need to make a cogent decision. The prospective patients need to be supplied with a written informed consent document. And then the PI or the sub-PI should explain each section, sit down and answer questions, and make an independent assessment if this subject really understands and is participating without duress. This kind of a subjective evaluation is important, especially if there's spouses, friends, families who appear to be pushing a particular prospective patient to join a study, and they're not quite ready. They're not ready to do that. So that's where the subjective piece, and that's why it's always advised to have the PI and perhaps another study staff in the room with the prospective patient to discuss this, to ensure that the patient really does understand. If a patient is enrolled and they fully understand the issues of the trial, the likelihood of them leaving partway through are probably reduced. It's also important to note that at the conclusion of this discussion, the patient or potential patient or subject, they need to acknowledge the information that has been conveyed to them and do so with a signature on an IRB or ethics committee approved informed consent form. No study procedure can be or should be performed until that document is fully executed. So it needs to be signed by the PI as well as the patient, prospective patient, prior to any study procedure being done on them. And I think the key to this is there are two keys. It's information and agreement. And once the document has been fully executed, a copy should be given to that subject and maybe their spouse or their family, or however that works. In looking at the clinical practices per se, good clinical practices, there are a lot of different pieces to it. There's education on the didactic information associated with treating patients, executing clinical studies, and the people who also play a support role, either in the lab, as nurses, as other people who are also playing a major role in the study. There are regulations to describe and articulate the expectations of a clinical study. There's oversight. Oversight can be performed by the sponsor. It can be performed by the regulatory health authority, such as the FDA. And it can also be performed by a clinical research organization as well. But there is oversight. Good studies are about checks and balances to ensure that everything's running as appropriate. Compliance with the regulations. Again, that's another piece of this particular puzzle. Ethics. There's got to be ethics. And when I say ethics, I'm talking about being honest, treating patients as expected, following the rules, following good medical practice. And then procedures that describe how information is transferred, how the protocol is performed, some of the information that might be found in supplemental documents, such as a pharmacy or lab manual. So in this short presentation, I want to give you some good clinical practice take-homes. Number one is patients first, safety, recording information, the information that's obtained, and also to respect and value their participation. Number two is ethics, which I just mentioned on, and I'm happy to give a speech about that later, but ethics are so important. Communication is another one, to the patients, to the investigator review committee or the institutional review board, the ethics committee. You have to be honest and communicate with them so they know what's going on. And references, when I say references, look at them, find out those things change over time. So what was good maybe 5 or 10 years ago, they evolve based on problems that have been found in the field. And then look, the documentation. These 3 key major documents are going to help anybody to perform clinical studies in accordance with good clinical practices. That's all I wanted to talk to you about today. I hope that you are enjoying the conference, and I want to thank you very much for your participation.